Dex Hensley didn't think much about it at the time. As a pilot for the Federation, he was used to running into all sorts of trouble out on the fringe. Smugglers, pirates, the occasional rogue asteroid, none of it was anything he couldn't handle. His ship, the Orion's Vengeance, was a sturdy craft built for speed and resilience. It had carried him through more than his fair share of firefights, and his instincts had been honed by years of dodging laser fire and slicing through asteroid fields. But this time, it was different. He was coming out of warp on the edge of the Vega system, en route to an uncharted trading station. His ship's sensors pinged with a faint distress signal, flickering on the edge of detection like a dying candle. It wasn't uncommon for signals to get scrambled out here, especially with all the ion storms that rolled through the sector. Still, something about this one caught his attention. The signal was weak, erratic, but distinctly of alien origin. "Looks like someone's in a bind," Dex muttered, pushing his hands over the console to engage his long-range scanners. He magnified the coordinates. Sure enough, there was a small shuttle adrift in space, half its systems offline, power barely registering. Just a routine rescue mission, he told himself. It would be quick. Pull them aboard, patch up their ship, send them on their way. Easy. As the Orion's Vengeance drew closer, Dex keyed in the emergency docking protocols. The ship was an older model sleek, with markings that were unmistakably those of an off-world royal family, though he couldn't quite place which one. Something stirred in the back of his mind, a faint warning bell, but he shoved it aside. "Can't leave someone stranded out here," he said, more to himself than anyone. That'd be bad form. Once he latched onto the drifting shuttle, he suited up and moved to the airlock. The shuttle's hatch hissed open. Inside, the flickering emergency lights cast long shadows across the cramped space. A body slumped against the far wall, small, delicate, wrapped in flowing, silver-blue robes. Dex knelt beside the figure and gently rolled her over. She was unconscious but alive, breathing shallowly. Her skin was a pale lavender, marked with faint silver lines that glowed softly under the dim lights. Her features were unmistakably alien: high cheekbones, elongated eyes with opalescent lids. He had no idea what species she was, but there was no denying she was young. A teenager, maybe. "What the hell happened to you?" he muttered. He ran a quick check of her vitals. There was no obvious trauma, but she was severely dehydrated, likely from being stuck in a dead ship for who knew how long. Without thinking twice, he hoisted her into his arms and carried her to the med bay aboard the Orion's Vengeance. As he laid her down, she stirred, her eyes fluttering open for a brief moment. Her gaze locked onto his, a flicker of panic crossing her face. "Shaish. It's okay," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm here to help. You're safe now." She didn't respond, her eyelids drooping shut once more as exhaustion overtook her. Dex frowned. Whoever she was, she didn't look like your average traveler. The robes, the markings, the craftsmanship of her shuttle, she was someone important. But important or not, she was just a kid, and someone had left her out here to die. It wasn't until several hours later, when the girl woke up properly, that things started to make sense. Sort of. Dex had been running diagnostics on her shuttle, trying to piece together what had gone wrong, when she suddenly appeared in the doorway of the cockpit, eyes wide, her breath quick and shallow. You saved me," she said in a voice that was soft, melodic, but threaded with confusion. "Yeah," Dex replied, glancing over at her. "Found you floating out there, half dead. Figured you could use a hand." The girl's eyes darted around the cockpit, taking in her surroundings as if she couldn't quite believe she was still alive. Then, as if a switch had flipped, her expression changed to one of alarm. "You have to leave. Now. Before they find you." Dex blinked, taken aback by the sudden urgency in her voice. "Whoa, slow down. Who's they, and what are you doing out here in the middle of nowhere?" Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "I don't have time to explain. But if they track me to your ship, you'll be dead. We both will." Something cold settled in the pit of Dex's stomach. This wasn't some routine rescue. Who are you running from? The girl hesitated, clearly torn between her need for secrecy and the danger looming over them both. She finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Amelia. I'm a royal heir, but I've been targeted for assassination. The ones hunting me, the Raethe Syndicate, they control half the galaxy's underworld. They don't leave loose ends." "Assassins," Dex repeated, his brain working to catch up. Why would they want to kill you? Amelia looked away, her gaze distant. Because I know too much. My family was involved with them. I tried to expose their operations, their dealings with governments across star systems. Now they want me silenced before I can reveal everything. Dex exhaled slowly, the weight of her words sinking in. He wasn't just dealing with a lost kid. This was a full-blown galactic crisis, and he'd just landed himself square in the middle of it. Okay, he said after a long pause. So you've pissed off the most dangerous criminal syndicate in the galaxy, and now they're after you. Great, but how do they even know where you are? Amelia's face tightened. They have tracking devices hidden, embedded in the ships, even in personal belongings. I thought I disabled all of them, but I'm not sure. Dex swore under his breath and glanced at the console. If they're tracking you, then it won't take long for them to figure out I've got you aboard my ship. We need to move. He launched the ship back into warp speed, heart pounding as he plotted a course away from the system. He had no idea where to go anywhere, but here seemed like a good start. I'm sorry, Amelia whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to drag you into this. Dex shook his head. Not your fault. Besides, it's not the first time I've been on the wrong side of some bad people. We'll figure this out. The truth was, Dex had no idea how to figure this out. He was just a pilot, not some kind of galactic spy. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that running wasn't an option. These assassins, this syndicate, they wouldn't stop. Not until Amelia was dead. And now, because of him, they wouldn't stop until he was dead too. The first attack came barely an hour later. Dex was in the cockpit, scanning for any signs of pursuit when the Orion's vengeance lurched violently. The ship's proximity alarm screamed to life, and Dex whipped around just in time to see a squad of sleek, black starfighters drop out of warp behind them. Shit, he muttered, hands flying over the controls. Hold on. The starfighters opened fire, their laser cannons spraying deadly beams across the ship's hull. Dex jerked the controls, sending the Orion's vengeance into a hard dive, narrowly avoiding the barrage. The ship's shields flickered and strained under the assault. Here Amelia's voice came through the comms, panicked. Yeah, I noticed, Dex grunted, pulling the ship into a tight barrel roll. He brought the weapons systems online, targeting the closest enemy fighter. Can you handle a gun? There was a pause. Yes, but... Then get to the turret and start shooting, Dex barked, the ship shaking as more laser fire grazed their shields. We don't have time for second guessing. Amelia didn't argue. Moments later, the targeting systems for the turret came online, and the sound of plasma bolts firing back at their pursuers filled the air. The first few shots missed wildly, but then Amelia adjusted, her aim improving with each blast. Dex pulled the ship into a sharp turn, bringing it around to face the squadron head-on. He squeezed the trigger, unleashing a barrage of fire from the ship's forward cannons. One of the starfighters exploded in a ball of flame, but the others quickly broke formation, circling around to flank him. They're too fast, Amelia's voice crackled through the comms. I know, Dex gritted his teeth. But we've got something they don't. And what's that? Dex slammed his fist down on the ship's auxiliary controls, activating the ion boosters. The Orion's vengeance shot forward like a missile, the sudden burst of speed sending them rocketing past the remaining starfighters. An escape plan, he said with a grin. The move bought them a few seconds, enough time to reach the edge of the system. Dex pulled up the star charts, searching for the closest safe haven. His eyes landed on a familiar name, the Raethe's Maw, a nebula notorious for its dense cloud formations and electromagnetic storms. A nightmare for most pilots, but to Dex, it was the perfect cover. We're heading into the Maw, he announced. The Maw, Amelia's voice was laced with fear. Are you insane? No one goes in there and comes out. Exactly, Dex replied, hands steady on the controls. Which is why it's our best shot. With the enemy fighters closing in, Dex veered the ship toward the looming nebula, its swirling clouds glowing faintly with crackling energy. The Orion's vengeance plunged into the storm, the ship shuddering as it was battered by waves of electromagnetic interference. Hang on, Dex shouted as the ship was tossed around like a leaf in the wind. The enemy fighters followed, but their superior speed quickly became a liability. As Dex navigated through the dense, turbulent clouds, the pursuing ships struggled to keep up. One by one, they lost control, spinning out of the nebula's magnetic grip and crashing into the storm. Only 2 ships remained on their tail, firing sporadically as they fought to keep the Orion's vengeance in sight. Dex dodged and weaved through the storm, his fingers flying over the controls as he pushed the ship to its limits. For a few minutes, Dex thought they might actually pull it off. The maw was a chaotic, volatile mess of energy and debris, and the electromagnetic interference was wreaking havoc on their sensors. But Dex knew how to fly blind. He relied on instinct, weaving through the swirling clouds of energy with a precision that most pilots could only dream of. But the Raethe Syndicate's assassins weren't ordinary enemies. They had the best ships money could buy, and they were relentless. One of the enemy starfighters broke through the storm, closing the distance fast. Dex saw the warning lights flashing on his console as the enemy ship locked onto them. A second later, a missile screamed toward them. "Damn it," Dex shouted, jerking the controls hard to the left. The missile narrowly missed the ship, but the explosion rocked them, sending the Orion's vengeance into a spin. "Hold on," he yelled again, fighting to regain control. Amelia's voice came through the comms, but it was drowned out by the alarms blaring inside the cockpit. The second enemy ship fired, this time aiming directly for their engines. Dex had just enough time to slam the ship into a dive, but the laser fire clipped one of their thrusters. The ship lurched violently, spinning out of control as Dex desperately tried to stabilize them. "We're hit," Amelia shouted over the comms. "Yeah, no kidding," Dex gritted his teeth, pulling back on the controls with everything he had. "I'm working on it." The Orion's vengeance spiraled through the storm, the clouds swirling around them in a dizzying blur. Dex managed to level them out just in time to see the 2 enemy ships closing in for the kill. His mind raced. They were outgunned, outmatched, and the Orion's vengeance was barely holding together. He couldn't outrun them, not with the engines damaged, and he sure as hell couldn't outfight them in a straight-up battle. But maybe he didn't have to. Dex glanced at the storm outside the cockpit, the wild, churning mass of energy that surrounded them. An idea sparked in his mind, risky, reckless, but it might be their only chance. "Amelia," he said, his voice tight. "I need you to trust me." There was a pause. "What are you planning?" "Something stupid," Dex admitted. "But if it works, we'll lose them." Another pause, longer this time. "Then, do it." Dex didn't waste another second. He pulled the ship into a sharp climb, heading straight for the heart of the maw. The enemy ships followed, their weapons blazing as they tried to keep up. As they neared the center of the storm, the electromagnetic interference grew stronger, messing with their systems. Dex could feel the ship straining under the pressure, the controls sluggish, the sensors flickering in and out. But he kept going, deeper into the storm, where the energy was at its most volatile. "Come on," he muttered under his breath, his eyes locked on the console. "Come on." The enemy ships were right behind them, closing in fast. Dex could see the missiles locking onto them, the lasers charging for one final barrage. And then, just as the storm reached its peak, Dex hit the emergency thrusters, launching them forward in a sudden burst of speed. The Orion's vengeance shot through the heart of the storm, just as a massive wave of electromagnetic energy surged through the nebula. The enemy ships weren't so lucky. The wave hit them head-on, frying their systems and sending them careening out of control. Dex watched as the 2 ships spun off into the storm, their engines sputtering and sparking. A moment later, they disappeared from the radar. Dex let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, slumping back in his seat as the ship finally leveled out. "That was insane," Amelia's voice came through the comms, breathless. "Yeah," Dex agreed, wiping sweat from his brow. "But it worked." He glanced at the console. The ship was holding together, but just barely. The engines were damaged, the shields were down to almost nothing, and half their systems were offline. They were in no shape for another fight. But for now, they were alive. And they'd bought themselves some time. The next few hours passed in a blur as Dex and Amelia worked to get the ship back in order. Dex focused on the engines, trying to coax them back to life, while Amelia worked on patching up the shields and restoring power to the weapons systems. They didn't talk much, both of them too exhausted and too aware of the danger still looming over them. But there was a quiet understanding between them now, an unspoken agreement that they were in this together. It wasn't until later, when they'd finally finished repairs and the ship was back in working order, that Amelia broke the silence. "I owe you my life," she said quietly, sitting down in the co-pilot's seat beside Dex. "Twice now." Dex shrugged, trying to play it off, just doing what anyone would. "No," Amelia said, her voice firm. "Most people would have left me to die. You didn't." He glanced over at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. He wasn't sure what to say, so he just nodded. "Well," he said after a moment, "you're not out of the woods yet. Those assassins won't stop coming after you, not until the Syndicate is taken down." Amelia nodded slowly, her expression hardening. "I know, and I have a plan." Dex raised an eyebrow. "A plan?" Amelia leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I told you before, the Syndicate has infiltrated governments across the galaxy. They have agents everywhere, pulling strings, controlling entire systems. But I have something they don't." "What's that?" Dex asked, curious. Amelia's eyes gleamed with determination. "Proof. Evidence of their operations, names, locations, everything. If we can get it to the right people, we can bring the Syndicate down for good." Dex leaned back in his seat, considering her words. It was a long shot, an insane, dangerous, impossible long shot. But it was also the only real chance they had. "All right," he said finally. "I'm in." Amelia smiled, a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "Thank you, Dex." "Don't thank me yet," Dex said with a grin. "We've still got a long way to go." The Orion's Vengeance hurtled through deep space, its engines running just strong enough to keep them moving, though every shift in speed sent a creak through the ship's hull. Dex kept his hands steady on the controls, feeling the tension in his own body matched by the strain in the vessel itself. Amelia was in the co-pilot's seat, silent but alert. The initial relief after escaping the assassins in the Raethe's maw had faded into a cold realization they were far from safe. But now, they had something they hadn't before: hope. Amelia's plan was a sliver of possibility, a chance to not just survive but to strike back at the Raethe Syndicate. Dex adjusted their course, aiming for the coordinates she had given him. So this proof. Where exactly are we headed to retrieve it? Amelia leaned forward, bringing up a holo map of the surrounding star systems. A few pulses of light shimmered on the display, highlighting a remote star cluster in the outer rim, far from any major trade routes or political borders. "Here," she said, pointing to one of the faint, flickering stars. "It's a neutral system called Valnus, a dead world, mostly forgotten by the galaxy. My father's personal archives are hidden there. It's where he kept records of all his dealings with the Syndicate, encrypted, of course. I'm the only one who knows the access codes." Dex whistled softly. "A dead world with a treasure trove of secrets. I'm guessing it's not exactly unguarded." Amelia nodded grimly. "The Syndicate's probably put a lockdown on the area ever since I went off the grid. They know what's there if we're lucky. They haven't been able to break through the encryption yet." "If we're lucky," Dex echoed with a wry grin. "Well, we haven't exactly had the best of luck so far." Amelia shot him a look, half exasperated, half amused. "Which is why we need to be smarter about our next moves. If we just barge in, they'll blow us out of the sky. But if we can get in unnoticed, I can pull the data and upload it before they even know we're there." Dex's mind raced as he processed her words. An infiltration mission. With their ship barely holding together, it would take a miracle to pull off, but he'd faced worse odds. He glanced at Amelia, her expression serious, determined. "You're a lot tougher than you look, you know that," Dex said, his tone lighter. Amelia smirked. "I've had to be." They both fell into silence, the hum of the ship's engines and the distant flickers of starlight the only things filling the void around them. Valnus was as grim and lifeless as its reputation suggested. The planet loomed ahead, a barren rock scarred by long-forgotten battles and surrounded by the eerie glow of a decaying atmosphere. Dex brought the Orion's Vengeance out of warp, keeping his eyes on the ship's radar as they approached the planet's surface. "Scanners clear for now," Dex said, though the tightness in his voice betrayed his unease. "But I'm guessing the Syndicate's ships are parked somewhere nearby." Amelia nodded, already suited up and preparing for what lay ahead. Their patrols will be focused on the orbit and the larger areas. My father's vault is located in a mountain range deep in the northern hemisphere, isolated, hard to reach. If we can land undetected, we'll have a chance to sneak in. Dex set the ship into a low orbit, scanning for a safe landing zone. All right, mountain range it is, but we better make this quick. The Vengeance can't handle another firefight right now. He guided the ship down, weaving through the rocky terrain until they found a narrow valley that offered enough cover. The landing was rough, the ship groaning in protest, but it held together. "We're on the ground," Dex announced. "Let's move." Amelia had already activated her wrist console, scanning the surrounding terrain. The vault entrance is about 3 kilometers from here. We'll have to go on foot. Dex grunted but nodded, grabbing his blaster from the weapons locker and holstering it. He noticed Amelia eyeing the weapon. "Just in case," he said. "I'm hoping we won't need it," she replied. "Hope's great, but I'd prefer a little firepower to go along with it," Dex shot back, smirking as they disembarked into the rocky wasteland. The air on Valnus was thin, cold, and every step they took echoed in the vast emptiness. The mountain range loomed ahead, jagged and sharp against the pale sky. Amelia led the way, moving with an agility that Dex found impressive. Despite everything, despite being hunted, despite the weight of what they were doing there, was a quiet determination about her that made him trust she knew exactly what she was doing. How much further, Dex asked after they'd been walking for almost an hour, the terrain growing steeper and more treacherous with each step. Just up ahead, Amelia answered, her voice hushed. "The vault is concealed in one of the cave systems. The entrance should be just around this bend." Dex followed, scanning the ridges for any signs of Syndicate patrols. It was too quiet. And as much as he hated to admit it, the silence was unnerving. As they rounded the bend, the entrance to the cave came into view, an almost imperceptible gap between the rocks, wide enough for them to squeeze through but completely hidden, unless you knew exactly where to look. "There," Amelia said, pointing. "It's just inside." Dex crouched, squeezing through the narrow gap, his blaster at the ready. Once inside, the cave opened up into a larger chamber, the walls lined with faintly glowing inscriptions, alien symbols that Dex couldn't begin to understand. But Amelia moved confidently, stepping up to one of the inscriptions and placing her hand against it. A soft hum filled the air, and suddenly the cave wall shimmered, revealing a hidden console embedded in the rock. "This is it," Amelia whispered, her fingers flying over the controls. "I'm accessing the vault now." Dex stayed back, keeping his eyes on the entrance, every muscle in his body tense. "How long will it take?" "Not long," she replied, her voice focused. "The data's still intact. Just need to download it to my console." The seconds ticked by, agonizingly slow, as Amelia worked. Dex's eyes darted between her and the cave entrance, his nerves fraying with every passing moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Amelia pulled back, her console beeping softly. "Got it," she said, her voice tight with relief. "We need to move, now." "Don't have to tell me twice," Dex muttered, already on his feet and leading the way back toward the cave entrance. But as they emerged from the narrow passageway, Dex's worst fears were confirmed. A sleek, black Syndicate cruiser hovered above the valley, its engines humming ominously. And from it, a squad of heavily armed assassins descended, their weapons drawn, their black armor gleaming under the pale light of Valnus sky. "They found us," Amelia said, her voice barely above a whisper. Dex's hand went to his blaster, his heart pounding. Well, this is going to get ugly. The lead assassin, a tall figure in crimson-accented armor, stepped forward, his helmet hiding his face, but his voice cold and mechanical. "Hand over the girl, and you might live long enough to regret your foolishness, human." Dex stood his ground, his blaster aimed at the leader's head. "I've never been great at taking orders." The assassin tilted his head slightly. "Pity." With a sudden motion, the assassin signaled, and his squad opened fire. Dex dove to the side, returning fire as he rolled behind a nearby boulder. Plasma bolts sizzled through the air, the smell of scorched rock filling his nose. He fired off a few shots, forcing the assassins into cover, but they were well trained, moving with deadly precision. Amelia crouched beside him, her hands trembling as she pulled out a small device from her pack. "I can disable their comms," she said, her voice shaking, "but it'll take a minute." "We don't have a minute," Dex shouted, firing again as another assassin tried to flank them. Amelia didn't respond, her fingers already working on the device. Dex cursed under his breath, realizing they were pinned down. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and their only cover was rapidly disintegrating under the constant barrage of plasma fire. But then a new sound cut through the chaos, a low, rumbling hum that grew louder with each passing second. Dex's eyes widened as he glanced up at the sky. "You've got to be kidding me." Above them, the Orion's Vengeance swooped down, its engines roaring as it unleashed a barrage of fire on the Syndicate squad. "You did set the ship's auto turrets, right?" Amelia asked, a small smile tugging at her lips. Dex grinned, feeling a surge of hope. "I knew that button would come in handy." The Syndicate assassins scattered, momentarily thrown off by the ship's sudden attack. Dex took the opportunity, grabbing Amelia's arm and pulling her toward the ship. "Run," he shouted, covering her as they sprinted across the rocky terrain, plasma bolts still flying past them. They reached the ship just as the ramp lowered, Dex practically shoving Amelia aboard before diving in after her. He scrambled to the cockpit, slamming his hands over the controls and yanking the ship into the air. The Orion's Vengeance roared to life, its engines blazing as they shot away from the surface of Valmus, leaving the Syndicate cruiser behind. Dex didn't breathe until they were clear of the atmosphere, the planet shrinking behind them. He glanced over at Amelia, who was slumped in the co-pilot's seat, clutching the data console like her life depended on it. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "We actually did it." Dex leaned back, letting out a long breath. "Yeah, we did." But as the stars stretched out before them, Dex knew this was only the beginning. They had the proof now, but that only meant the real battle was about to begin. He glanced over at Amelia, a sense of quiet determination settling over him. "Now," he said, his voice steady, "let's take down the Syndicate." And with that, the Orion's Vengeance shot forward into the unknown, carrying them toward a future that neither of them could predict but one they would face together.